If you look at the periodic table of elements, there are over 100 elements that are known to science. These elements have drastically different properties based on the number of protons and electrons they have. However, life on Earth relies heavily on only 6 of these elements. Specifically, life on Earth requires carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. But why these elements? The AP test will definitely ask this question in one way or another. So, come along with us as we tour the elements of life and find out why they are so important. This video covers section 1.2 in the AP Biology curriculum, the elements of life. In this video, we'll start by looking at the Miller-Urey experiment, which helped scientists determine which elements were most important to life. Then, we'll examine how carbon forms the basis of most organic molecules, and why oxygen and hydrogen are also important. Then, we'll start to look at how carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen form hydrocarbons, and the role hydrocarbons play in cells. After the quiz, we'll see how different forms of molecules called isomers can create different functions. Finally, we'll take a look at how different functional groups can be added to a molecule to allow it to serve different roles in cells. If you only need to review one of these topics, feel free to skip to the times outlined here. Let's get started. In one of the most famous historical experiments ever conducted, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey were able to prove that the highly volatile early atmosphere of Earth would be able to create the molecules of life without an actual organism. The team created a system in which water vapor was allowed to react with simple atmospheric compounds such as hydrogen gas, methane, and ammonia, while being subjected to powerful electrical shocks to stimulate lightning in the early atmosphere. The scientists found that not only did these molecules combine in unique ways, but they started to create some of the same molecules produced by biological organisms, such as the complex carbon-based molecule urea. Though this experiment was completed in 1953, much more recent research has confirmed the results and has shown that even more complex molecules like RNA could have formed through early natural reactions in the Earth's atmosphere and oceans. Before getting into the complex macromolecules that organisms need to survive, we must first understand that there are several elements that all life is dependent on: hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. While all organisms use these substances, different types of organisms have different ratios of these atoms in their body. For example, a grasshopper has a ratio of 5 carbon to 1 nitrogen, whereas the grass it eats has a ratio of 33 carbon to 1 nitrogen. This means that the grasshopper's metabolism incorporates less carbon into its body than nitrogen from the food that it eats. This is just one way that organisms can use the same elements to create very different structures. And since all organisms on Earth use the same basic elements, it suggests that life on Earth has a common ancestor. Think about this. Though all life on Earth is based on the same set of atoms, organisms combine these atoms into very different molecules. These molecules then determine the structure and function of their cells. The structure and function of individual cells creates organs and organ systems with different purposes, which eventually creates organisms that can function very differently. This is known as the biological hierarchy, and it all starts with the important atoms we are looking at in this video. Carbon is by far the most important of the atoms presented earlier. Carbon is special because it has the ability to form 4 covalent bonds to other molecules. The study of carbon-based molecules is known as organic chemistry. Carbon has the atomic number 6, meaning that it has 6 protons and 6 electrons. This means that carbon stores 2 electrons in the inner shell and 4 electrons in the outer valence shell. Since the second electron shell of an atom can hold 8 electrons, carbon is constantly trying to fill up its outer valence shell by adding 4 more electrons. This means that carbon naturally forms 4 bonds with other atoms, whether that is 4 separate atoms or multiple bonds with a single atom. The valence shells of atoms like oxygen, nitrogen, or sulfur do not allow for this many bonds and therefore do not make the basis of life on Earth. About 71% of the Earth's surface is covered with water, a simple molecule made of one oxygen and two hydrogen atoms. So, it should not be surprising that hydrogen and oxygen are also heavily used in living organisms. Together, oxygen and hydrogen create a polar molecule, with one side more positive than the other. This polar property not only makes water a great solvent, but many molecules utilize this property to create more complex reactions. For example, many large, complex biological macromolecules are created using dehydration reactions, and the same molecules are broken apart by hydration reactions. We will cover these reactions in detail in section 1.3. The basis for almost all biological macromolecules is long carbon chains with attached hydrogens, called hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons are naturally nonpolar and hydrophobic. However, by adding different atoms and functional groups to a carbon chain, it can take on a wide variety of other properties. For instance, by adding oxygen and hydrogen to a hydrocarbon chain, it becomes a polar molecule. This imbalance of electrons makes the molecule much easier to combine and store within cells. This is essentially how complex molecules like nucleic acids, lipids, and many other biological macromolecules are created. Now that we have covered carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, let's see if you can answer a few AP-style questions. You can pause the video now and take this short quiz. You can find answers to all the questions in this video through the quick test prep link in this video's description to see how you did. The fact that carbon can form 4 distinct bonds with other atoms also leads to the phenomenon of isomers. Isomers are molecules with the same elements but a slightly different structure. Structural isomers contain all of the same atoms, but they are arranged in a slightly different order. These different shapes can lead to drastically different functions. Cis-trans isomers contain double bonds. Since double bonds are rigid and cannot rotate, this leads to different forms of a molecule based on where the various functional groups are attached. If the functional groups fall on the same side of the double bond, the molecule is called the cis isomer. If the functional groups are bonded on opposite sides of the double bond, they are known as trans isomers. Lastly, enantiomers are molecules with the same atoms that are arranged like mirror images of each other around a carbon that forms an asymmetric center. For example, if we flip this mirror image of D-lactic acid around into the same orientation, we see that the OH group now projects in the opposite direction. Enantiomers may be either L or D, L for levo or left, and D for dextro or right. Enantiomers can have vastly different functions in organisms based on this relatively minor structural change. The important thing about isomers is that they do not always function in similar ways. Consider the drug Ibuprofen. This is the active form. It has a methyl group that sits in this orientation and a hydrogen atom on the other side of this asymmetric carbon. In the inactive form, the methyl group changes position with this hydrogen. That tiny change renders the molecule useless as a medicine. Ibuprofen can no longer bind to the specific receptors throughout the body that cause its physiological reactions. Isomers are one reason why it is very difficult to develop useful medicines. Whew! Even the best things in life get boring if you do them for too long. Now's the time to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll finish up by looking at the many different functional groups that give molecules specific functions. While carbon itself gives rise to the possibility of isomers, it is also very important what other molecules are attached to carbon in a biological molecule. In fact, there are several very common structures that get added to hydrocarbons that give molecules different properties. They are called functional groups, namely because they add specific functions to molecules and are needed for many complex biological reactions. There are 7 main functional groups used in biology that add specific properties to carbon chains. Hydroxyl groups add polarity to a molecule, allowing it to interact with water and other polar molecules. Hydrocarbon chains with a hydroxyl group at the end are known as alcohols. Carbonyl groups allow a variety of bonds to be formed at the double-bonded oxygen atom. Molecules with carbonyl groups are called aldehydes when the group is at the end of the molecule, and ketones when it is in the middle. Carboxyl groups form an acid in water, which allows the molecule to donate a hydrogen to complete a large variety of biochemical reactions. Similar to how carboxyl groups create an acid, amino groups act as a base because they are negatively charged and can attract a proton. Amino groups are crucial for forming proteins as they allow for the bonds between 2 amino acids to form into long chains that eventually fold into functional molecules. Sulfhydryl groups can form cross-links with other sulfhydryl groups in other molecules. This is used by many proteins to create a rigid 3D structure. Methyl groups are not reactive, but they serve many roles within a cell. For instance, DNA methylation makes the cell ignore certain genes in the DNA code. Lastly, phosphate groups give carbon chains the ability to interact with water and release energy for other reactions. Phosphate groups allow molecules like ATP to provide energy to many different reactions that would not be possible otherwise. Phosphate is also a critical atom in the formation of the DNA and RNA backbone. That's it for isomers and functional groups. Were you following along? You can now pause the video again to test your knowledge. Answers to all the questions in this video can be found through the quick test prep link in this video's description, along with a number of other resources that can help you study for AP Biology. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video and found it helpful, please like the video, leave us any comments or questions you have about the elements that are important to life, and subscribe to the Biology Dictionary channel to easily find all of our AP Biology content. Good luck!